Oral questions, question orale, the honourable member for Carleton.
One of the good things about having a drama teacher as Prime Minister is that it's very entertaining. Our Prime Minister has been acting like he's standing up to Donald Trump, when in reality, he's just backed down. He backed down to Donald Trump and agreed to impose higher drug prices on Canadian seniors for higher profits for American drug companies. He backed down to Donald Trump giving the U.S. president a veto over Canadian trade deals with other foreign countries. He backed down to Donald Trump and imposed Canadian export controls on our dairy products. When will he stop backing down and start standing up for this country?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, the government got a good deal. And let me explain something. The Conservative post-battle courage is ironic, given that last year Stephen Harper and the Conservatives were imploring us to capitulate and accept any deal at any price. Let me quote, Mr. Speaker. Harper's memo said, "It does not matter whether current American proposals are worse than what we have now." Who said that? Mr. Harper did. Over and over, the Conservatives urged us to take Harper's advice. That was not our approach, Mr. Speaker, and we got a good deal.
The honourable member for Carleton.
In that very memo, Stephen Harper predicted that this government would capitulate. And it turns out Stephen Harper was absolutely right about that. They capitulated and imposed higher drug prices on Canadian seniors so that Donald Trump's corporations could make higher profits. They capitulated, giving Trump a veto power over Canadian trade deals with other countries. They capitulated and imposed Canadian penalties on Canadian dairy products being exported abroad. And meanwhile, they did not get any relief for the U.S. protectionism on Canadian products. When will they finally stop backing down to Donald Trump?
Well, Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, we got a good deal, unlike their recommendations in times gone by. This deal improves on the initial NAFTA in the following ways. We removed the investor-state dispute system that allowed companies to sue Canada for hundreds of millions of dollars. We got rid of the energy ratchet clause, which restricted the Canadian government from access to our energy resources, and this is good news for our oil patch workers. The new auto rules of origins are great news for Canadian workers. We also have much stronger labour and environmental chapters, and we protected Chapter 19. This is a good deal, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Carleton.
Well, getting rid of the investor-state provision was actually a demand of Donald Trump. The Liberals actually support investor-state protections. They put them in CPTPP and in CETA. So to now take credit for for a capitulation that they did in favor of Trump is laughable. And as for this ratchet clause, they were trying to flip through the deal to find something they had won on. It turns out this ratchet clause has never been used in 30 years, just to show how irrelevant this so-called victory was. They got nothing on steel tariffs, nothing on softwood tariffs, nothing on Buy America. Why did they get so little?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, let me continue with the list of the successes in the renegotiated NAFTA. This agreement is a massive step forward for progressive trade. We, for example, have the strongest labour chapter of any trade agreement that Canada is party to. In fact, the enforceable provisions that protect women's rights, minority rights, Indigenous rights, environmental protections are the strongest in any Canadian trade agreement to date. As National Chief Perry Bellegarde of the Assembly of First Nations recently said, the provisions addressing Indigenous peoples in the USMCA make it the most inclusive international trade agreement for Indigenous peoples to date. Mr. Speaker, this is a good deal.
The honourable member for Portneuf-Jacques-Cartier. Mr. Speaker, this government says it negotiated a good deal. They're rejoicing over the USMCA. To my mind, the definition of negotiation is giving in exchange for something. They gave access to our dairy market. They capitulated to the U.S. by allowing tariffs to stand on steel, aluminum, and softwood lumber. They accepted higher costs for pharmaceutical drugs. They capped the auto industry. And on top of that, Mr. Speaker, now we'll have to ask President Trump's permission if we want to negotiate trade deals with other countries. They call that a good deal? Well, where are the gains, Mr. Speaker? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Foreign Affairs. Mr. Speaker, this is a good deal for Canada. The most important thing is that Canada preserved its access to the American market, and we dropped the investor-state dispute mechanism that allowed for challenges against this government for hundreds of millions of dollars. We also now have control over the access to our resources. New rules will protect our workers in the automobile sector, and we have solid chapters on labor and the environment, and we have protected Chapter 19. The Honourable Member for Portneuf-Jacques-Cartier. Mr. Speaker, how can this government celebrate over the deal with the United States, Mexico, and then last on the list, Canada? The negotiations aren't over because now we have these overtaxed products by Canada in order to put pressure on negotiations with the United States, and they still stand. For example, in Portneuf-Jacques-Cartier, Biscuit Leclerc, a cookie company, has plants in Canada and in the United States, but we're going to have to pay tariffs to import our own products into our own country. When will the government withdraw those tariffs so that Canadian consumers can pay less for their products? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Mr. Speaker, it's interesting to see this post-battle courage on the part of the Conservatives. As we know, last year, Stephen Harper and the Conservatives implored us to capitulate and accept any deal at any price. Now, thanks to our patience and to our negotiating skills, we have obtained a good deal for Canada. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Member for Berthier-Maskinongi. Mr. Speaker, yesterday the Prime Minister met with dairy producers from Canada and Quebec to update them on the breaches granted under the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement. He acknowledged that dairy producers will suffer a little, but the reality, Mr. Speaker, is that our producers are going to suffer a lot. They'll be losing a month's worth of wages. That is a staggering amount, and it is absolutely unacceptable. My question is simple. How can the Liberal government pay so little attention to the Quebec dairy sector? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Mr. Speaker, we know that our dairy producers produce high-quality products at a reasonable price and support the prosperity of our regions. Now, we understand that there will be repercussions for our producers, and we are committed to compensating them fairly and appropriately. We will be creating a working group with dairy producers and the industry in order to help them move forward. The Minister, the Prime Minister, and myself have met many dairy producers over the course of the past week. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Member for Berthier-Maskinongi. Mr. Speaker, the Liberals are not listening to agricultural producers. Family farms are in danger. The next generation of producers is worried, and all this because the Liberals have opened up once again another breach in supply management. The system was already weakened by concessions made under CETA, and the Liberals have once again used our agricultural producers as bargaining chips. When the Liberals abandon supply management, they are letting down all middle-class families and the next generation. Do they realize this? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Mr. Speaker, we have stood up for supply management, and we have stood up against aggressive attempts on the part of the United States to dismantle it. Access to our market is similar to the access negotiated by the Conservatives under the TPP. We are the party that established supply management, and we are the government that are going to stand up for it, and that's exactly what we did. We are committed to fairly and appropriately compensating our producers. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Palkley Valley.
Mr. Speaker, when it comes to the Trans Mountain Pipeline fiasco, Liberals keep repeating the words meaningful consultation, but clearly have no idea what it actually means. Because how can it be meaningful when the Prime Minister slams his fist on the table again and again, saying this pipeline must be built? And how can it be meaningful when the Liberals bought the 65-year-old pipeline, essentially making themselves both judge and jury? They say the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. So my only question to the Liberals is, how long is it going to be until the Liberals simply dump their failed strategy and actually begin to respect Indigenous rights and title?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Natural Resources.
Mr. Speaker, on Indigenous consultations, we have a clear path forward provided by us from the Federal Court of Appeal. That includes 3 concrete steps. First, we will not appeal the court's decision. Second, we will re-engage Phase 3 consultations with all Indigenous groups impacted and ensure that Indigenous voices are at the table so we can have a meaningful dialogue. It means a two-way dialogue. We will not only listen, we will exchange, and we will seek to accommodate where possible. Third, Mr. Speaker, we have appointed the Honourable Frank Yakabuchi as federal advisor to oversee the consultation process. We believe it's worth taking the time to get it right together.
The honourable member for Skeena-Bulkley Valley.
Speaker, last week I had the honour to attend the memorial for Chief Wataget, Henry Alford, in northern British Columbia. He was the last living Wet'suwet'en chief who argued the Delgamuukw case all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada, where he stood on the stand hour after hour while government lawyers tried to break down his understanding and knowledge of his territory, and he won. He won, establishing rights and title and the ability of Indigenous peoples to stand up in this country for those sacred rights. So my question to the Liberals is, how exactly are they honouring Chief Wataget's memory and all the Indigenous communities and leaders who have fought for that principle generation after generation?
Hear, hear.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, for far too long, Indigenous people have fought to have their rights recognized and implemented. As a government, we are committed to doing things differently. While we set a high bar to begin with for TMX consultations, we understand that we can and must do better. That is why we will not appeal the court's decision. We share the court's view on moving forward by engaging in meaningful and focused consultation with Indigenous groups, and that is exactly what we intend to do.
Member for Wellington, Halton Hills.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday the government said Chapter 32, which requires us to get Washington's permission to negotiate free trade with certain countries, wasn't a big deal because, quote, any party to NAFTA is allowed to leave within 6 months' notice, end quote. That's ridiculous. The government knows full well that Canada is not going to quit a trade deal that 1 in 5 Canadian jobs depends on. So, effectively, the government has given up our independence in setting trade policy for Asia-Pacific. Yes, the government got a deal, but at what cost?
The Honourable Minister of International Trade.
Speaker, I'm trying to understand the Conservative position on China. On Monday, it tells us that we're way too close. On Tuesday, they say we're not close enough. But we probably can agree on one thing, that a $40 billion investment that will send clean Canadian LNG to Asia is good for us, it's good for the planet, and we don't have to ask anybody for permission.
Bravo.
Before the next round of questions, I just want to remind the honourable members that I'm trying to hear the questions and the answers, and with the chatter going on, it's nice to see everybody getting... I'm sorry? Oh, did you? Sorry, I thought you had a point of order. Sorry, the honourable member for Carleton. I just want to remind everyone that there's questions taking place, and if you don't mind, let the person ask the question so we can hear it, and the person answer it so we can hear it. The honourable member for Wellington, Halton Hills.
Mr. Speaker, this isn't about any one party's position on free trade with China. It's about our sovereignty to negotiate those kinds of deals. They also sold us out on our exchange rate policy, on our central bank policy. As Greece has found out, if you don't control your central bank, you don't have a sovereign state. If Washington doesn't like our exchange rate, Chapter 33 forces us into consultations to arrive at a mutually acceptable solution. The Liberals were so desperate to get a deal, any deal, they sold Canada out on our central bank policy. Again, yes, they got a deal, but at what price?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, Canada gave up none of its sovereignty in this deal. We have the capacity to enter into agreements with any country in the world when we believe that is in Canada's interest. And by the way, Mr. Speaker, these provisions apply to all 3 countries who are party to the negotiation. It's very hard to predict what one country or another may feel 2, 6, or 8 years from now, but one thing we know for sure, Canada is free to enter into negotiations with any country that it chooses.
The honourable member for Edmonton-Wetaskiwin.
Mr. Speaker, with Manitoba coming out strongly against the Liberal government's carbon tax this week, the Prime Minister's signature initiative now has the support of just 2 provincial governments. I asked the Environment Minister a clear question yesterday, and today I'm hoping for an actual answer. There seems to be a clear consensus among experts on all sides of the issue that the government will not come close to meeting its international climate change commitments. Can the Minister confirm that the government is in fact not on track to meet its Paris Agreement targets?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of the Environment.
Mr. Speaker, with respect, the government was elected on a commitment to grow the economy and protect the environment at the same time. We are moving forward with a plan to protect the environment that includes a price on pollution, and it's disappointing that Manitoba won't take threats posed to the environment seriously. With respect to the question on the Paris Agreement, we are confident that we can reach the Paris Agreement without question. We're moving forward with plans that include not just a price on pollution, but investments in public transit, investments in clean technology, and an oceans protection plan as well. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton-Metaskowit.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's interesting that the Parliamentary Secretary answers a question that the Minister refused to answer yesterday. So given that support for the carbon tax, which forms the backbone of the Liberals' climate plan, is literally disintegrating around us, and given that even in the best-case scenario there are huge gaps between emissions projections and the Paris targets, how many billions of Canadian taxpayer dollars is the government projecting will have to be spent on overseas carbon credits in order to make up for the Liberals' climate plan shortfalls?
The Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, with respect, the question grossly mischaracterized what's happening across Canada. The plan that we put in place specifically invites the provinces and territories to come up with a plan, and when they fail to take steps responsibly that will actually meet the targets that we've set across Canada, we will implement a federal backstop to ensure that Canadians, no matter which province they live in, benefit from a healthy environment. Mr. Speaker, the great thing about our plan is that it's simple. It puts a price on pollution. It's going to make life more affordable for Canadians and more expensive for polluters.
The Honourable Member for Lévis-Lotbinière. Mr. Speaker, the carbon tax is substantially increasing Canadians' cost of living expenses. Everything we buy is more expensive now to make and ship. Fortunately, several provinces are rejecting this unfair tax, especially for low-income families. Mr. Speaker, we know full well that the purpose of this tax is to pay down our staggering debt. Rather than lead Canadians to believe they will be getting the money, will the government commit to immediately withdrawing this tax and leaving the money in the pockets of Canadian families?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, once again, the honourable member completely mischaracterized what's going on. And if you don't believe me, I invite him to read the report of Mark Cameron. Even Stephen Harper's former Director of Policy has indicated that this government's plan is going to put more money in the pockets of Canadian families and at the same time lead to a reduction in emissions. It is disappointing in the extreme that the honourable member will take money from his constituents to make pollution free again.
The Honourable Member for Saskatoon-Grasswood.
Mr. Speaker, I want to remind everyone it was Saskatchewan that was the first province to stand up to this Liberal government and oppose what Premier MOTZ calls the destruction made in Ottawa carbon tax. Now, Saskatchewan's joined by Ontario, PEI, Manitoba, Alberta, and there will be more. In Saskatoon yesterday, the Premiers, Moe and Ford, met, declared a strong united front against this worst tax ever. Canadians can't afford another Liberal tax. When will the Liberals respect the provinces and end this carbon tax?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
With respect, Mr. Speaker, we now know that the Conservatives have no plan. Their leader has no plan. They won't even commit to meeting the Paris targets. Mr. Speaker, this is because Conservatives are focused on
The Honourable Member for Saskatoon-Grasswood asked a very good question, and I'm waiting for the answer, and I'm sure he is too. So I'd ask the Honourable Members to maybe not chatter as much so that we can hear that answer. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
As I was saying, Mr. Speaker, it seems that the Conservatives only plan to tackle climate changes to keep pollution free again. And when they are scratching out some make-believe plan on the back of a napkin, we are actually moving forward with measures that will reduce emissions and keep life more affordable for Canadians. We are investing in public transit, we're investing in clean technology, we're putting a price on pollution, and this is what Canadians deserve.
The Honourable Member for Laurier-Sainte-Marie. Mr. Speaker, trying to get a seat on the UN Security Council is admirable, but the government's strategy does not make any sense. Canada is looked down upon by OECD countries when it comes to development assistance. The Liberals aren't doing enough to tackle climate change, nor to promote peace in the world, including in the Middle East. Our allies are disappointed in us, and Canada's reputation, unfortunately, is not getting any better. Do the Liberals realize that it is not enough to say that Canada is back? We have to act. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our accomplishments are many. We have worked with North Korea. We have met in Vancouver with 20 other countries. In Venezuela, we are a very important member when it comes to promoting peace. Canada is a part of missions in Mali, for example. We have done superb work in Myanmar. We have responded to the crisis by providing more than $300 million, and there are many other examples to make sure. Honourable Member for Jonquière. Mr. Speaker, during the renewed NAFTA negotiations, Canada caved to Donald Trump's demand to extend copyright from life plus 50 years to life plus 70 years. A Saguenay citizen, Mr. Jean-Marie Tremblay, created a collection of more than 7,000 works over the past 25 years. This change now will have made a major impact on essential works for students. Is the government aware that by letting Donald Trump rewrite our laws, our education system is the one that will pay the price?
The Honourable Minister of Innovation.
Mr. Speaker, we've been very clear when it comes to copyright, intellectual property, that we have a very comprehensive plan. That's why we introduced the Innovation and Skills Plan. And part of that plan is an $85.3 million commitment to the first national IP strategy. And the objective of this strategy is to make sure that we help people generate more IP, that they get more IP benefits. And with regards to copyright as well, Mr. Speaker, this is going to help artists, this is going to help creators, this is going to help the industry grow, and this is good for Canada, and this is good for our economy.
Honourable Member for Haliburton, Kawartha Lakes, Brock.
Mr. Speaker, every day the Liberals fail to get our oil to new markets. It costs Canadians $50 million in lost revenue because of deep discounts to our American consumer. Continued delays on the Trans Mountain expansion means Canadian jobs are at stake. The Liberals must immediately appeal the federal court decision and request a leave so construction can continue. Speaker, why don't the Liberals recognize they can consult and appeal at the same time, or are they just purposely stalling this project?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And it's interesting to hear in the House today we have the NDP that are saying that we should not even engage with First Nations. Basically, we should abandon the project. Now we're hearing the Conservatives saying we're not going fast enough and disregard the courts completely. You know what? We will take no lessons from the Conservatives who cut corners at every turn. They disregarded environmental concerns, and they also think that consulting with Indigenous peoples is a suggestion, not a constitutional obligation. You know what? They did not build a single kilometre of pipeline to overseas markets. The Leader of the Opposition is doubling down. It's déjà vu all over again. It's clear that the Conservatives have learned nothing from their decade of failure on major projects.
Excellent.
Honourable Member for Calgary-Midnapore.
Mr. Speaker, if the Prime Minister were serious about ensuring Trans Mountain moves ahead, he would be doing everything possible to make it happen. He should have begun consultations and appealed the court decision immediately. Why is this Prime Minister incapable of consulting and appealing at the same time?
Great question.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Actually, Mr. Speaker, the message that was sent to the Indigenous community is that we want to consult, and that we don't want to consult, and basically we don't want to see the pipeline move forward. At the end of the day, Mr. Speaker, we will take no lessons from the Conservatives who have no credibility on this file. Disregarding Indigenous consultations, disregarding the environment, we will take the time to get this right, meaningfully engage with First Nations along the corridor of the project to make sure that we get this right.
The Honourable Member for Sturgeon River Parkland.
The Liberals' so-called plan to get Trans Mountain built won't get shovels in the ground for years. The Minister of Natural Resources came to my riding this summer and turned some sod. And that photo op is the extent of their progress on this file. The project was the most highly consulted in Canadian history, but the Liberals are starting from scratch. Their plan failed. When will the Liberals start using all the tools at their disposal and get this pipeline built?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, let me be very clear, we are not starting over. There has been already a lot of work that has been done. We are building on the relationships that we have, the information that has been gathered, and the consultations done to date. We know, though, that we'll take more time to meaningfully engage with the First Nations, meaningfully dialogue on a nation-to-nation basis to make sure that we get this right. We are respecting the Federal Courts of Appeals judgment, and we intend to make sure that we have specific and focused dialogue with the First Nations along the project corridor. Merci.
The Honourable Member for Banff Airdrie.
Mr. Speaker, we know the Prime Minister and his Ottawa Liberals couldn't care less about Alberta or about Albertans. While Albertans are struggling to find work and people are losing their jobs, their homes, and their businesses, the Liberals continue to sit on their hands and do absolutely nothing. They bungled the Trans Mountain expansion that would have created thousands of good-paying jobs. Due to Liberal incompetence, our oil and gas workers are left with nothing. Why have the Liberals so failed Albertans?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Quite the opposite, Mr. Speaker. We are supporting the workers all across Canada to make sure that major projects get the license that it needs to be forward, but we need to do so in the right way and respect the courts, respect Indigenous communities, and respect the environment, something that is completely foreign to the Conservatives. We will take no lessons from them. Merci, Mr. President.
The Honourable Member for Esquimalt, Saanich Sooke.
Mr. Speaker, on average, more than one member of the Canadian Forces dies by suicide each month. Unfortunately, serving members often struggle to get the help they need, with one barrier being that self-harm is still a disciplinary offence under the Military Code of Conduct. This policy is archaic and does nothing but keep men and women serving our country who face mental health challenges from seeking help. Will the minister support the NDP amendment to Bill C-77 to remove self-harm as a disciplinary offence and help serving members get the help they need and deserve?
L'honorable secrétaire parlementaire au ministre de la Défense nationale.
Merci, Monsieur le Président, et je remercie mon collègue pour...
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague for his question and his excellent work on committee. We do believe in the right of victims in the military justice system. We have added to the disciplinary code victims' rights, and that we guarantee victims' rights and give the victims services to help them navigate the judicial system. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Nearly 2 years ago, the Defence Committee unanimously recommended that service records of those kicked out of the military for being lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender be revised to honourable discharges. Nothing happened. Nearly a year ago, the Liberal government issued a formal apology to those women and men. Nothing happened. When will the Minister of Defence put in place a process to revise the service records of these former members of the Canadian Forces who are still waiting for their honourable service to be acknowledged?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Mr. Speaker, as you know, with our new defence policies, we've put men and women ahead of everything else. We want our men and women to be able to have the capacity and what they need, the gear, and we want them to have what they need, and we're continuing to do this, and we'll continue for years to come.
Aurora.
Mr. Speaker, in my riding of Newmarket Aurora, like all of us, there are a number of successful women entrepreneurs. However, we know that women entrepreneurs face unique barriers and challenges. Fewer than 16% of SMEs are majority women-owned in Canada. Only 8.4% of women-owned businesses export compared to almost 13% of men-owned. Women-owned businesses have a much more difficult time accessing capital. Could the Minister of Small Business and Export Promotion update this House on what she is doing to help support women entrepreneurs and to build a more inclusive and strong economy?
Honourable Minister of Small Business.
The honourable member for that question. The full and equal participation of women in the economy is essential to Canada's competitiveness. That's why last week I announced the Women Entrepreneurship Ecosystem Fund. It's up to $85 million fund that will strengthen and help women entrepreneurs succeed. This program will close gaps. It'll make it easier for people to find the mentorship that they need. It will help organizations better respond to the needs of women entrepreneurs and produce the kinds of initiatives that they've been asking for. According to the McKinsey Institute, addressing women's empowerment has the potential of adding $150 billion to the Canadian economy.
The Honourable Member for Chicoutimi-Le-Fjord.
Vas-y.
Mr. Speaker, dairy producers in my region are very worried about the effect of the USMCA on them. They have not only opened the market to American products under Class 7, but they've also capped Canadian exports. And like with the TPP showed, we cannot trust the government to provide just compensation? When will the government finally respect dairy producers, and when will we have all the details on compensation? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Mr. Speaker, we have defended our supply management system, and the Americans' aggressive attempts to dismantle it were fended off. Now, we are the party which implemented the supply management system, and we are the government that will defend it, and that's exactly what we did. We are committed to compensate dairy producers efficiently and fairly. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Yorkton Melville.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday Global News reported that Veterans Affairs has absolutely no idea how many family members receive benefits. Canadians are already appalled that this minister refuses to end funding for the murder of Officer Catherine Campbell. Can the minister assure Canadians that no other murderers like Chris Garnier are receiving benefits that are intended for veterans?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Veterans Affairs. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The priority is to provide veterans and their families the support they need. 129,000 veterans are provided with services, those who have been wounded. Last year, 1,400 veterans got benefits for themselves and their families and money to help them recuperate and make a transition in their careers. And hiring new people will help provide veterans with better services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this week, Veteran Affairs confirmed that they had no idea what the services are provided for veterans' families and the number of people that are using them. It's the Liberals' responsibility to track those numbers and ensure those receiving services are deserving of them. Unlike Chris Garnier, who still is receiving taxpayer-funded therapy for PTSD caused by the murder of Officer Christine Campbell. Can the minister assure us that there are no other inmates receiving benefits intended for veterans? Can you answer the question, please?
I'm sure the honourable member doesn't want me to answer the question. I'll just defer to the honourable parliamentary secretary.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I said earlier, in my first answer, we have figures, and they're simple. 1,400 veterans got services last year. We're going to continue our priority to provide veterans and their families with benefits. 1,400 veterans got services, and even more got help with illness. So we want services for veterans and their families. We want to work with case managers, and we will continue to do so.
Here, Mr. Speaker, we're not talking about benefits for veterans and their families. We're talking about benefits for the adult children of veterans. And veterans who are injured serving Canada have to pay for the counseling of their adult children because of the effects those injuries have on them. Chris Garnier is an adult child of a veteran, yet he's in prison for murder and receiving benefits. Now the minister says he has no idea how many family members of veterans are receiving benefits from his department. Can the minister assure us that no other adult children or prison inmates are receiving benefits that are intended for veterans?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I said earlier, my colleague across the way says we have no figures, but we do. Almost 1,400 veterans have got these services through different agencies. We are working unstintedly to provide veterans and their families with the care they need. And contrary to the Conservatives, we believe that when a veteran serves, the family also serves. The veteran remains at the very heart of what we do. Anything that concerns services to members will be there for them. And we have done this for almost 1,400 veterans. It seems that the members across the way are saying it's a bad thing.
Mr. Speaker, this year the Liberals have cut funding for HIV and AIDS treatments in northern Saskatchewan, despite the record high cases in the province. Nurses and health professionals have called on this government to take urgent action. After meeting with Elton John, the Prime Minister said he is committed to creating an AIDS-free future. Now that he heard from health professionals and from a Grammy winner, will the Prime Minister restore funding immediately to Saskatchewan HIV/AIDS organizations? Yes or no?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, our government is deeply committed to addressing HIV and AIDS in Canada, and we are proud that we have increased spending in this area following the cuts by the Harper government. This year, our government is investing $87 million across country to tackle HIV and other sexually transmitted blood-borne diseases in Canada. We are also providing funding of $30 million under the new Harm Reduction Fund to prevent and control HIV and hepatitis C among people who share drug equipment. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Hamilton Mountain.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Seniors seems to prefer avoiding questions about pension protection for Canadian workers and retirees. Hard-working Canadians deserve answers from this government. When the minister was appointed, her mandate clearly stated she was to conduct meetings and to protect workers' pensions. Canadian workers have heard nothing since. Mr. Speaker, why is she refusing to listen to Canadian workers and retirees? And will this minister take action on changing Canada's bankruptcy and insolvency laws? Yes?
The Honourable Minister of Seniors.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to take this opportunity on World Teachers' Day to acknowledge the contributions of our teachers and thank them. We know that their efforts go well beyond the classroom. Mr. Speaker, in response to the member's question, we as a government take pension security very seriously. This is why we increased the CPP, something that hasn't been done in 20 years. Further, with respect to his question, we know, Mr. Speaker, this is a decades-old problem, and our government is committed to getting the right solution, which is why in our 2018 budget we've committed to consulting with stakeholders, and in my mandate letter it's also a commitment we've made. Mr. Speaker, we're not looking for any solution, we're looking for the right—
Honourable Member for Niagara Falls.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday we found out that the Russian military has engaged in a number of serious cyber attacks. Not surprisingly, the World Doping Agency and the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons were targeted. Now, these attacks were designed by the Russians to disrupt investigation into Russia's numerous violations of international law, in particular the nerve attack in the United Kingdom. So I'd like to ask the Minister of Foreign Affairs, what specific action is she going to take in response to these Russian attacks on Canada, and will she introduce new sanctions and expel members of the Russian diplomatic corps from Canada?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, I thank my honourable colleague for his question. Yesterday, we joined our allies in exposing malicious cyber operations by the Russian military, specifically the GRU. These acts form part of a broader pattern of activities by the Russian government that flout international norms, demonstrated disregard for international law, and undermine the rules-based international order. We call on all those who value this order to come together in its defense. Our position towards Russia remains clear and strong. We will always stand up to these cyber threats, and we will never let Russia threaten Canadian stability or security. Thank you, Mr.
The Honourable Member for Medicine Hat, Cardston-Warner.
Mr. Speaker, one of the only Canadian firearms manufacturers has stalled production pending confirmation of the firearms marking regulation set to come into force December 1st. 25,000 people are employed by 4,500 firearms businesses in Canada, and they just want to get on with their business. Will the minister advise when they will announce another 11th hour deferral, or if this poorly drafted regulation will come into force on December 1st? Distributors, dealers, and manufacturers need some clarity so they can get on with their business.
Right on.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
I'd like to thank the honourable member for his questions. We share Canadians' serious concerns about gun violence and will be working hard to address the problem. We have a very comprehensive review being done by Minister Blair at the present time, and we will enhance background checks. We will be removing the 5-year limitation, allowing any history of violence, including mental illness associated with violence, to be considered when someone applies for a license. This is a good step in the right direction, Mr. Speaker.
I just want to remind the honourable members that when we're referring to someone else in the chamber, that we refer to them as from their riding or by their title, not by their name. The honourable member for Medicine Hat, Cardston-Warner.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And it's clear by the Parliamentary Secretary's response that they don't understand the question, and they're certainly failing on another issue. Thousands of small businesses need clarity today on whether the government is going to move ahead with this poorly drafted regulation, or if common sense will prevail, a deferral issued and a new regulation drafted. Will the minister do his job, meet with industry so they can provide their expertise on firearms markings, and fix this flawed regulation to avoid further negative impacts on Canadian businesses? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Public Safety.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we have legislation that is currently going through that addresses some gaps and weaknesses dealing with legal weapons. We have enhanced background checks. We have ensuring that sellers will verify. We will have ensuring that vendors keep records of sales to allow for tracking. Mr. Speaker, we are on the right direction and we will move forward. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Don Valley East.
Mr. Speaker, during Women's History Month, we celebrate women that make an impact. One way to make a significant impact is to help young women across Canada to reach their leadership goals. We all remember last year when this place was filled with young women from coast to coast to coast in the first ever Daughters of the Vote program. Can the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of the Status of Women tell this House how our government is supporting the next generation of women leaders in Canada?
Well, Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Status of Women.
Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the honourable member from Don Valley East for her question and her tireless advocacy. Mr. Speaker, promoting gender equality is not only the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do for our economy and the middle class. But we need governments with more women representation if gender equality is to be truly achieved. That is why this week, Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Status of Women announced that we are investing $3.8 million to further the great work of the Daughters of the Vote program. Mr. Speaker, our government is proud to support this important project that empowers young women to seek public office and helps build a more representative democracy for everyone.
The Honourable Member for St. Albert, Edmonton.
Mr. Speaker, Constable Sarah Beckett paid the ultimate sacrifice when she was killed in the line of duty by an impaired driver. This week, her husband, Brad Aschenbrenner, spoke out against Bill C-75, which waters down sentences for impaired driving causing bodily harm. Will the Liberals listen to Sarah's husband and other victims and remove from Bill C-75 the watering down of sentences for this serious crime?
Hear, hear, hear.
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and without question, our hearts go out to the family of Constable Beckett in this tragedy. I will say that our government is incredibly proud to have introduced and passed legislation that amounts to one among the most toughest impaired driving laws in the world. And I will say, with respect to Bill C-75, it does not in any way, shape or form change the principles of sentencing, which focus on the proportionate to the gravity of the offence and the degree of responsibility of the offender. What C-75 does, it gives prosecutors the necessary discretion to determine how—
The Honourable Member for West Nova.
Mr. Speaker, Canada's century-old national park system is unlike any other in the world. Yet in 2014, the Conservative government cut funding to the parks by over $29 million. My favorite national park, Ketchimakujik, is in my riding of West Nova. This beautiful park was once used for year-round winter hiking, camping, and skiing. Can the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Environment tell me and my constituents what is being done to improve our national parks and ensure year-round access?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the member from West Nova for his continued work in ensuring that Canadians get to enjoy Keji and other national parks all year round. Unlike the Harper Conservatives, our government is ensuring meaningful experience in parks across the country. To do this, we've actually made park entry for youth free forever and made substantial investments in programs and experiences to ensure more Canadians have access to nature and historic sites. In Keji-McClintic, this means that there's $4 million in upgrades to Jeremy's Bay Campground, and I look forward to working with the member to ensure that we can enhance year-round access to our national park system, including Keji-McClintic. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Beauport-Limoilou. Mr. Speaker, in 2015, our Conservative government affirmed its support for the Port of Quebec Beauport project. Now, this was contingent on the project passing muster during public consultations and also with the Canadian Environmental Assessment Agency. Given these legal considerations, the Minister of the Environment is responsible for taking a decision on this file. Mr. Speaker, will the government be telling us if it anticipates a decision in the near future? Can we have a timetable?
Mr. Speaker, we're familiar with the project and understand there's been some developments as recently as April. The Canadian Environmental Assessment Agency is conducting the environmental assessment on this project under the CIA 2012 rules. Our government understands the importance of timely decisions while ensuring those decisions are based on science, facts, traditional knowledge of Indigenous people, input from the public, and of course evidence. I'm certain that the agency will work in collaboration with the Minister to make a recommendation, and a responsible decision will be taken in due course.
The Honourable Member for Repentigny. Yesterday, the Transport Minister dodged my request for a commission of inquiry into the Lac Mégantic tragedy, saying the people there didn't want one. And yet, that very day, a citizens' coalition and organizations working for rail safety were on the Hill. Mr. Speaker, calling for this commission. The Minister's right. They don't want to relive these events. They want to make sure it doesn't happen again. Will the Minister listen to the people of Lac Mégantic and order the holding of a public commission of inquiry, an independent one? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
I think we can all agree that no person and certainly no family should have to go through what the people of Lac Mégantic have gone through. That's why the Minister has made rail transportation his #1 priority. We have investigated this issue thoroughly and we have taken unprecedented action. We are working with the communities of Lac Mégantic, Frontenac and Nantes to ensure that the rail bypass goes forward, and we'll continue to take action to rebuild this beautiful community.
The Honourable Member for Joliette. Mr. Speaker, I think what the people of Lac Mégantic want is a commission of inquiry. Now, when the trade agreement with Europe was reached, the government had promised to compensate provinces for the increase in the price of prescription drugs. Now, this was in the mandate letter of the Minister of Foreign Affairs. 3 years later, not the slightest hint of a program. Here, the government is doubling down and is driving up prices a second time with NAFTA 2, and this without compensation. When will the government honour its word and compensate Quebec for its agreements? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Mr. Speaker, we know just how proud Canadians are of our healthcare system, and we will continue to work with provinces, territories, and their partners to reduce prices and provide easy access to prescription drugs. Our government wants to attract new researchers to Canada, and our government will always defend our public healthcare system. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Member for Joliette. Well, Mr. Speaker, not the slightest sign of compensation. The government has promised that it would compensate those who have lost out with this agreement. And then it's signed, but all these agreements and didn't compensate. This is what happened with the FTA, NAFTA, the EFTA, and the CKFTA. We've already seen this film, Mr. Speaker. When will the government bring in a program that will provide full compensation for dairy producers for the last 3 agreements that it signed on their backs? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our government is taking initiatives to make sure that Canadians pay less for their prescription medication. We're working with provinces and territories to make medication more affordable. We have the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance, which has allowed Canadians to save more than $2 billion a year. We're investing more than $140 million to improve access and support innovation in healthcare. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, this morning, Statistics Canada reported that our country has lost 24,000 manufacturing jobs over the past year. Among the factors depressing Canadian manufacturing employment are American tariffs on our steel and aluminum exports. The new free trade deal with the U.S. should have ensured tariff-free access to the U.S. market. Does the government have a plan and a timeline to remove American tariffs from Canadian metal?
The Honourable, the Honourable Minister for Innovation.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the member opposite for his question. He should understand that our government fully supports steel and aluminum workers. That's why we provided a $2 billion support package to address the concerns specifically in the steel and aluminum sector. This $2 billion support package will help small and medium-sized businesses by providing with additional financing through BDC and export financing through EDC. We're very confident that this plan in the short term will help them, and we'll continue to engage our American counterparts to find resolution on Section 232 regarding steel and aluminum.
And that's the end of oral questions for today. Un appel au règlement du membre du député de Joliette.
The member for Joliette has a point of order. Yes, Mr. Speaker. I think that if you seek it, you will find that there's unanimous consent for this motion. That the House call on the government to implement a program that provides financial compensation to egg, poultry, and dairy farmers for all the losses they sustained due to the breaches in